Hello, welcome, and happy Saturday. I hope you're all doing well today and enjoying your weekend. We're live on YouTube. Welcome. Thank you for joining. If you're catching this later and wondering, how do I tune in live? I'd say the best way is to head to colememo.com/YouTube. Once again, that's colememo.com/YouTube, and subscribe to my YouTube channel so that you never miss a stream. This podcast also releases for streaming on SoundCloud, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcasting platforms. So earlier this week, I traveled to Joliet, Illinois to meet with Illinois State Senator Rachel Ventura, today's guest. In case you didn't know, Illinois law requires that cannabis must be transported in a sealed or resealable, child-proof, odor-proof container. And this is a subject that I've discussed on the show in the past with lawyers. So after this episode, if you're looking to learn more, check out the show notes for links. And this is also a topic that I've written about at colememo.com. So I'll also put links to those articles in the show notes. So I traveled to meet Senator Ventura earlier this week on March 17th, and I released this interview first at colememo.com/Patreon. It's just $3 a month to become a member, and members get access to episodes before they release to the public. Just a quick heads up, if you're on an Apple device, I recommend signing up from a computer or a non-Apple device. Apple adds extra fees on top of what I feel is a very fair price of $3 a month, which isn't ideal, but hey, big tech always has to get their cut, right? All of my episodes ultimately release for free on public feeds, but again, if you'd like early access, consider becoming a member at colememo.com/Patreon. Once again, that's colememo.com/PATREON. It does cost a lot to do this show, between licensing fees, the cost of travel, the cost of equipment, and more. This show is brought to you by listeners like you. If Patreon's not your thing, you can make a one-time, monthly, or yearly contribution of your choice at colememo.com/support. That's right. You can throw $1 or $2 my way if that's what you're able to contribute. And if you can't support financially, that's totally fine. Honestly, one of the best ways to support this show is by smashing that like button, sharing the show with your friends, or leaving a positive review from wherever you're listening from. So, without further ado, enjoy this episode of
The Cole Memo.
The Cole Memo. The Cole Memorandum.
The Cole Memo.
The Cole Memorandum.
The Cole Memo.
The Cole Memo is what allows this whole thing to go on.
I mean, you have to respect the memo.
Hey, this is Tommy Chung, and you're listening and watching The Cole Memo.
I guess I'm getting old. I wanted to just thank you for making the time to sit down with me this morning, Senator Ventura. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, and just to start, do you mind giving my audience an intro as to who you are? And I would even love like a short, recap of how you found yourself where you are today. I know you've been in public service for quite a while, but do you mind giving us the highlight reel, how you found yourself?
Sure. I never thought I would be a politician, but I did go to school, public school initially, and then I graduated from Benedictine with a math degree. I initially wanted to be a veterinarian and work with animals, but I didn't do so great in my 8 a.m. biology class, which I routinely slept through. And so then I was convinced to become a math major, and I worked for an insurance company for a couple years here in Illinois, and then after I graduated out in California. Unfortunately, what I saw in the healthcare industry back 20 years ago pales in comparison to the for-profit system we have today. But it just didn't align with my soul and what I wanted to be doing to help people. It was quite the opposite. I felt like I was hurting families, hurting hospitals, et cetera. And so I went back to school and got a biology degree and started working as a pet nurse out in Virginia at the time, and saw that a lot of the healthcare systems for animals wasn't much better than that of human beings. So I really did some soul searching if that's what I wanted to continue to pursue. Later, I ended up marrying someone in the military, and we moved to Georgia, where I had my twin daughters. And then we moved to different states. And in 2016, I left an abusive marriage and moved back here. I had worked in publishing for about 10 years after I left. I was a naturalist before we left Georgia, and I really enjoyed that job, but it was a lot harder to do that with the kids. And I was able to work from home doing publishing. So in 2016, there was the rise of Bernie, Hillary, Trump, and I was politically involved because I cared about the planet and our food system, and was really rooting for Bernie at the time, and didn't like the way the Democratic Party handled all of that. So when I moved home, I was complaining about plastic bags being in trees and litter in our streets here in my hometown of Joliet. And my dad was the one who asked me what I was going to do about it. And I was like, I don't know, a cleanup? And he's like, no, run for office. Yeah. I laughed in his face. I was like, Dad, my kids and I live in a 10 by 10 room in your house with whatever we could fit in our car. I'm going through a very horrible divorce right now. I don't know where my life is going to end up. I cuss like a sailor. I tell people how it is. I am the last person who needs to be a politician. And he was like, nonsense, you would make a good public servant. You should go down to City Hall and see what they're talking about. So I figured, all right, well, I was 35 years old. I had not been to a government meeting before in my life. My dad used to be a politician before I was born. He was on the Will County Board. And so I went down there, and they were talking about defunding the Rialto, which is a theater I'd acted in when I was a very young child. It's a beautiful theater. And so I thought, okay, we got to save this theater. But what was surprising to me was how mean our mayor at the time was. He was insulting people. He was cutting them off, yelling at the other council people. And I thought to myself, I cannot leave an abusive marriage and end up with an abusive government.
Yeah.
And so that was it. I went home. I told my dad, okay, I'm going to run for office. And so I ran for City Hall initially, narrowly lost that race, and then immediately ran for the Will County Board. And I was elected there as the top vote getter, and spent 4 years on the county board. I was also the vice chair of our forest preserve, and spent a lot of time trying to bring green infrastructure projects here and green policies to Will County, helping with the homeless, helping with trying to just help the middle class and working families make more with less. But it always felt like the Band-Aid fix, that we needed more going into our communities. And it was always a struggle to try and carve some of that out. So when the opportunity came to run for higher office, I did take it. I initially ran for Congress in 2020 and narrowly lost in the primary, and then moved on 2 years later to run for the open seat for the Senate. And I've tried to bring a lot of that same love of planet and people with me to the Senate. And I think my dad was right. I do make a good public servant because I'm willing to listen to the people. I still don't think I make a good politician because I don't play all the games. I don't take dollars from corporations or lobbyists. And so I make my job a little harder down in Springfield.
Yeah. It was for all those reasons. Like I was telling you before we came on air, I watched some interviews that you had given in the past, and all of those reasons are why, among the subject matter we have today, I was so excited to speak with you today. Like, it sounds like a lot of our values align. You really touch my heart when you talk about like some of the green policy proposals, I guess, that you support. Not only that, though, you have the experience working at a forest preserve and stuff like that. So have you always just been like outdoorsy, or? Yeah,
I've always been a tree hugger. I am a lifetime Girl Scout, but I did go through all of the different brownies all the way up through senior I have my silver award. My parents just took us to Hamel Woods and other forest preserves here in the area. We've gone camping. My kids, I've taken them to, they've been to 48 continental states and about 30 national parks. Partly I wanted them to see them before they were gone, because you never know what the political will is going to be of the future. So yeah, I'm pretty outdoorsy. And I mean, at the end of the day, my time in office, I want it to be a planet that we saved and a planet worth living on. And that means we have to have communities worth living in.
Yeah. Yeah. What's the saying? It's like wise people plant trees whose shade they know they'll never
Yes.
sit in or whatever. So,
Yes.
yeah, I think it's very admirable. And I heard that origin story that you had mentioned on one of the interviews that I watched, where you said, you notice the plastic in the trees, you notice the garbage, and it's just like, yeah, I think too often it's easy to, I'm not faulting anybody, but people overlook those things, and it's, yeah, it's just super important. I wasn't alive for this, but I think of the Indian crying, the Native American crying commercial, right? So.
Yeah, the Lorax is still one of my favorite movies and books, but yeah, I think people notice it when it's gone, right? And even now, there's signs that our trees are not healthy because of some of the pesticides that we spray, and yet because they're not dead, it's okay. But as storms rip through here, it's basically hurting the tree's immune system. But when we don't have trees, we have all kinds of problems with weather, with flooding, with oxygen, pollution, et cetera. So I was really excited last year when I passed a bill to create a grant program for local government and nonprofits to get grant dollars to plant trees, and they can use it as a match for federal funds, because at one point the IRA had lots of money for states to go after. We're not sure with this the current administration how those federal funds are going to be doled out, but I was really excited to see that some of my colleagues believe that investing in native grasses and trees are just as important as everything else we do down in Springfield.
Yeah. It's I think it's easy for us to think that we're removed from nature, because like even right now we're in a nice office, we've got technology, like but we really, like, it is a symbiotic relationship, and I think it's too easy to forget until, like you say, it's gone or we're experiencing huge issues. So for you to take a proactive approach on some of these, and just to even talk about them, to make it part of what you speak about, like, it just really spoke to my values. So I appreciate that there are people like you out there, that are fighting the good fight in so many different ways, but particularly with regard to the environment, because obviously a lot of the policies that we'll even discuss today touch people in a very personal way. But like, what more personal way than like making sure that the air we breathe is good? I heard you talking about your aquifer here. We have similar challenges and debates around the aquifer where I live in central Illinois. So yeah, I just wanted to thank you for your service in that.
Yeah,
way.
and I think it's some of it is reshifting the argument that it doesn't have to be as grand as global warming or climate change or saving the planet. It can be a shift of what is it that I deserve as a human being? And I think later on we'll probably talk about mental health and how it intersects with all of this stuff. But if I believe I deserve a healthy body and a good home to live on, then that means supporting the things that give me that. Mm-hmm. If my town is full of litter and pollution, then those are the things that are impacting me. If I'm losing soil and I don't have access to clean water, then that's directly impacting my home and my body. And if I can't be safe in my body and I can't be safe in my home, how can I be safe in this world?
Yeah.
And so I think that if you kind of shift the narrative, like what can I do locally for me, whether that's purchasing healthy food to eat, whether that is doing a park cleanup in your neighborhood, when you start looking at the immediate impacts you have, it's a lot easier to feel how you fit into the system. Mm-hmm. But I think when we're like, oh my God, how do I personally stop climate change? Well, you can't. It's literally going to take all of us. And so it's hard to keep that front and center. When the storms come through or the earthquakes come through, yes, it's front and center. But there's so many other immediate things, right? We think about our education, our bills, our healthcare. But this is something that if we continue to remind ourselves every day, when you get water out of the faucet, when you turn your lights on, like, am I going to continue to have these things in the future? How can I make them forefront important priorities as well, then it starts to shift the narrative. But if we have this big, huge thing we can't impact, it's easy to kick that can down the road. So I think that if people just start thinking about climate crisis as, how does it personally impact me right now, and what can I be doing because I deserve to have a healthy body and a good home, and that home isn't just the home around you, but the community that you live in.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's, kind of one of my maybe last thoughts on this subject is like, I think it's easy to get even overwhelmed when you look at the scale of some of the problems that we're discussing. But when you bring it to your local level, I don't know, I don't mean to speak for everybody, but at least in my experience, it makes the topic feel less intimidating and in a way also more rewarding. When you can say like when you can look around and even see on your drive to work or something that there's less trash, whatever it may be. I guess the reason I'm dwelling on that point is that I hope that serves as a point of inspiration for others that may be tuning in, that yes, of course, we should be discussing these grand scale, national, world, global issues that we're facing. But I think there's no better way to start to chip away at that than to start at your local level.
Absolutely.
So, well, we recently met, and it's funny, my friends make fun of me sometimes because I told them this story. I said, I went to a hearing for a subject that I've been tracking for a while, this issue that's caused with the cannabis odor-proof container. And the thing that my friends made fun of me about was I told them, well, I was sitting down next to somebody, and I looked at them and I said, "Are you Senator Rachel Ventura?" And you were like, "Yeah." And they were making fun of me at the fact that I can just recognize senators by face because they don't, keep track always of those things. But I'm just curious, can you give background on this issue and why, I guess, you've taken up trying to address it?
Yeah, so there's a lot of background, as you are aware. We'll start by my predecessor, John Connor, who was in the Senate, who was an attorney. He had filed the bill initially before I got in because there were competing appellate court cases at the time on whether or not probable cause could be used to search a vehicle or detain someone. And so they were ultimately, there ended up being 4 appellate court cases. And the 2 here in Will County had ruled that they could not use probable cause or they couldn't use the smell alone for probable cause. And so then by the time I had come on, there had been a lot of stuff happening in Aurora where Black Lives Matter had happened and police were continuing to pull over people of color at a higher rate than you would normally see based on the population. And so it was brought to my attention by some advocates in Aurora that this was going on and that we really needed to help pass the bill that John Connor had previously filed. And so I looked into some of the research on it and looked at the appellate cases. And so I said, yeah, a lot of this had to do with a loophole for law enforcement, that all the body cam laws that we had brought out after 2020, this is something that a body cam doesn't pick up. So it's easy for a law enforcement officer to say they smell something and there'd be no other mitigating factors that prove that that person was even had cannabis at all, whether it was raw or had been smoked. But it was used to search the car or detain. And sometimes those incidences then escalated to something that had nothing to do with cannabis.
Right.
Obviously, cannabis being legal in Illinois, we want to put it on the same parity as other substances like alcohol. So, for example, if a police officer pulls you over and then smells alcohol in your breath, they can't just immediately search the vehicle. They would then have to do a sobriety test. And depending on how that sobriety test ends up, depends on whether or not they would have probable cause. So even just trying to align the parity of cannabis and alcohol are really important, I think, for all of our Fourth Amendment right, which is the unreasonable search and seizure amendment. But We ran this bill my first year, so 2 years ago, and it passed the Senate. When it went to the House, there was some concern about using the word probable cause in the actual legislation as opposed to it being directive. The courts really felt like that's something that they would typically rule on, or set as precedents, not typically in law. And so at that point, the bills were picked, or I'm sorry, the appellate court cases were picked up by the Supreme Court. So it was asked if we would be willing to hold the bill until the Supreme Court had a chance to rule. So we did that. And then this last summer, we had 2 rulings come out. The first earlier in the summer was on the burnt cannabis, saying that indeed that was not enough for probable cause to search the vehicle. However, later in the fall or late summer, another ruling came out that said the smell of raw cannabis could be because our law mandated that packaging needed to be odorless. And so there was kind of a hint in the dissent opinion to say perhaps the legislators want to fix this.
Yeah.
And so then it became more imperative to bring the law back to clarify these 2 now very different rulings. And essentially, we removed the word probable cause out, and we just gave the directive that law enforcement cannot use the smell of odor alone to search a vehicle, whether it's raw or burnt, but then also remove the odorless packaging, because not all the packaging we have today is, in fact, is quite difficult to get odorless, like truly odorless packaging.
Right.
And so someone who is completely following the law could unknowingly be breaking it in a sense, and be pulled over by police and then perhaps harassed just because they've purchased cannabis. So we don't want that to be the case. I do want to add, though, that you should not be smoking and driving a vehicle. That is very important. And it doesn't matter if you just smoked it 2 hours ago. It needs to be completely out of your system. Otherwise, you are driving under the influence. And that is absolutely illegal. However, if you smoked yesterday and your jacket has the smell of cannabis on it and you get into the vehicle the next day to go to work, obviously we don't want anyone harassing anyone for doing that, nor do we want them being pulled over, unnecessarily searched because they purchased cannabis. That being said, please make sure it is in the trunk, out of your reach. The rest of the bill for child-proof packaging and is sealed, it is still very much the law.
Yeah, and I would even say that that's in parity with you talked about making the laws kind of between alcohol and cannabis in parity. I feel like that like you just said, it must be sealed. I know for alcohol, it's not required for it to be childproof, but setting that aside, it's like you said, required to be out of reach. And thank you for the PSA for folks, because some people have jokingly wrote into the show. We've had lawyers on the show, and they say, well, so is the key to make my car smell like burnt cannabis? And I think that goes back to the suggestion that the Supreme Court made, which is like, this is confusing for people. And they encouraged the General Assembly. They said they were aware that the General Assembly was taking up legislation, and they encouraged the General Assembly to, kind of reform this, because it just, from one of the dissenting opinions, I can't remember which judge, but it doesn't make sense, even from a justice's perspective.
Yeah, Mary Kay O'Brien wrote the dissenting opinion, and she was on the appellate court when she ruled on the Will County, the 2 cases going through there. And I would also add that the bill only says the odor of cannabis. So again, if there are mitigating factors, if they pull you over for swerving, or for going too fast or too slow, or not using your turn signal, and then they smell the odor, and even if anything else happens, they probably have probable cause at that point. And so it is imperative that people do follow the law. But we don't want this to be used as a easy loophole for law enforcement to search people who they think might be dangerous or breaking the law when they don't actually have the evidence. I think it's really important for trust within our law enforcement that we that they are following the procedures set out, and that when there is evidence of a crime or evidence of someone breaking the law, that they can act accordingly, but also that they are public safety officers and they're not there to harass us or give us a hard time, but to indeed make sure we're compliant with the law. And so this is also to make sure that we're not putting an undue burden on law enforcement. Not only does raw cannabis and burnt cannabis can smell similar, but so can hemp. And so that is very much a legal product to grow and transport even across state lines. And so by the time you start asking a law enforcement officer, well, what's the difference in these smells? It's going to be almost impossible for them to know whether they violated your Fourth Amendment right.
Yeah, and I always make the joke that as a person that has been studying this plant for years, that's my joke, you'd fool me on if you brought me into a room blindfolded. Cole, is what you're smelling burnt or raw cannabis, depending on the strain, depending on a variety of factors, I may answer incorrectly. And again, this is I'm speaking as somebody who's consumed cannabis for over 10 years.
Yeah.
And so I just, like you say, it feels like undue burden on law enforcement. And also one of the things that law enforcement made clear in the hearing that we attended was that not only are they resuming the training on canines, but that canines have a 10,000 to 100,000 times the sense of smell that we do. So, the comment was made and law enforcement brought in a container and they said, well, we can't smell it. Nobody can smell cannabis in here, right? Okay, maybe we can't, but bring one of your canines in, and I think it's a different story.
Right, and that's just it. I mean, they're smelling for the plant fibers essentially, and so they're not going to necessarily know the difference between burnt or raw or hemp. So it's become quite a problem for the state. So we are hoping that the bill passes the Senate here and doesn't have any problems in the House, and that the governor will indeed sign it so that we can have a clear directive on what the law is, so that people are for sure are following it and law enforcement are using our laws appropriately. Yeah,
and I just want to reiterate something you started off with, folks. I'm breaking the third wall here. Or is it the fourth wall? I don't know. This isn't a pass to consume cannabis in, during, or before the vehicle. It's so that law enforcement cannot simply use the smell in and of itself to detain you, search you, or, as you just alluded to, you go to these cannabis dispensaries, and I made this point in my testimony, if you've been, it smells like cannabis inside the dispensary. And what's important for people to understand is that, and some people don't know this, they think oh, I order something from the dispensary, somebody's putting it in the jar in the back. No, these packages come pre-packaged, which means that the moment you purchase it and get into your vehicle, you're out of compliance with the law. And you could be doing nothing wrong. According to some lawyers I've spoken to, you could have it out of arm's reach. You could have it sealed, which are all required by the law, we'll say again. But if they claim that they smell cannabis and they find cannabis, the way that this is currently outlined is you get a Class A misdemeanor. We talk about the detain and searching a lot, which obviously sucks. But when you've not done anything wrong, and they simply find and sometimes, as lawyers have told me, they'll say, somebody will get pulled over and I smell cannabis. Oh yeah, officer, I've got a bag in the back. They confirm there is indeed a bag in the back. Well, that's a Class A misdemeanor because you didn't have it in an odor-proof container.
Yeah, and we had the week of the hearing, there were 2 court cases here in Will County. Both were dismissed because they felt that the probable cause had been violated. I think in one instance they had found, when they searched the vehicle, some crumbles of cannabis. So again, make sure it is in the packaging in the back, and you're not accessing that, in the vehicle. But yeah, I think that it's important that they didn't find anything else is basically part of the problem is that law enforcement, that, if they do find a weapon or whatnot, they're trying to then pin the person on the weapon, but the search itself would not have been viable to begin with. So I think just to clarify everything for police and residents, we want to make sure we have clear laws moving forward.
Yeah, and law enforcement's testimony was nothing short of interesting. I don't know if you noticed it. I'll display it on screen for my listeners right now, but at Capital News, Illinois, actually took a photo of the container that they had bought in. And I'm not making any allegations here. I'm just sharing my observations. The product was not branded. It was mislabeled. I reached out to the company that was on the label. They said they've never put any of their cannabis in the packaging. Again, not making any allegations. I think the point that you made with regard to that, and I don't think either of us knew at the time these details that I just shared, was that bringing in one single package is not representative of all the cannabis packaging.
Yeah. And I mean, I also made the point that we don't know how old that cannabis is. We don't know the different strands of it have different smells. So I think that it's impossible to say. And like you said, that packaging, I believe, was for an edible or gummies of some
Correct.
type. And so obviously it had been repackaged. So, it's not clear that that was indicative of all cannabis across the board. But I think more to the point that you made is that when you go into these dispensaries where they are not packaging it, they are simply selling it and you're picking it up and it smells like cannabis, then clearly our packaging is not 100% odorless. I had to ask for, one of the senators had told me beforehand that someone had brought in packaging that was odorless, and it had convinced him that there was indeed odorless packaging. So I had simply said, great, I'd love to talk to that company. I'd love to talk to the people who are manufacturing odorless packaging so I can ask them some questions. But I was never given a name of what that company was that guarantees odorless packaging. And I think that comes to the heart of it, is that if a company isn't willing to come out and say, yes, 100% our packaging is odorless and we will stand behind it and we will stand behind any lawsuits that happen because of it, okay, then that's a different story. But we don't have that today. We don't have a company coming forth making those claims, willing to deal with the lawsuits and liability of it, because the truth of it is there's too many factors that go into the cannabis itself that can then impact whether the smell is strong and will be smelled outside the packaging.
Yeah. And I believe there's a hearing in the House today. There was a hearing in the House last week that I actually ended up making it to. I don't know if you heard, but I had to serve jury duty for the first time in my life last week, which is an interesting process. And fortunately, one of the days we got released on an afternoon, and I found out there was a hearing in the House. And so just to illustrate the point, I stopped by a dispensary on the way. I picked up a package of pre-rolls. Apparently, it reeked up the whole hearing room. And I don't know if it was just a coincidence, but the bill didn't get called. But what I tried to do was I bought it in its packaging. I kept the bag shut. I had the receipt inside so I could just, because there was a lot of questions last time that sort of demonstration was done. And so I wanted to show people, I bought this an hour ahead of time from a dispensary right down the road here in Springfield, and we can all smell it. I mean, I got multiple comments. Representative Carol Ammons came up to me and said, "Is that you?" And I was like, "Yeah, I mean, yeah, I brought in a package today to prove the point that an unopened, sealed package from the dispensary obviously reeks, and this is a problem." But I didn't mean to get off on a tangent there. One of the explanations that law enforcement gave was that if we were to pass your legislation, that criminals or cartels, I think they said, which includes people that traffic guns, drugs, and possibly even human trafficking, would use cannabis as a cover odor, and that their dogs, when they do a free free air sniff, I think they called it, can't discern between the scents they're trained on. So they're trained on like 4 scents. One of them is cannabis. The other 3 are different substances. And they basically made the case that retiring and training new canines would be such a financial burden that it would almost just be too much. That's the sense I was getting. And I'm just curious what you think about this idea. I felt that they were basically saying that cannabis consumers are just going to have to be collateral damage in our continued war on drugs.
Yeah, I mean, I think that some of that testimony was interesting because when I had spoke with the sheriff's representative beforehand, he had informed me that they had basically stopped using or were filtering out the dogs who can smell cannabis because it's legal here in Illinois, and it's really important that they're hitting on substances that are not legal. So obviously a lifespan of a dog anywhere between 10 and 20 years, depending on the breed. Every 10 or 20 years, you're going to have to be retraining canines in order to continue to do that type of work. Then they're trained on all kinds of things, right? Bombs and electronics, as well as substances, seizures, other type of diseases, schizophrenia, things like that. So it really depends on what you train that dog for, at a young age. And so we continue to obviously evolve with that. I think when we pointed out some of the aspects of, if a dog obviously is trained on smelling for fentanyl or opioids and stuff like that, that they're not necessarily going to be trained on cannabis at the same time. And so I think that that's the shift away. It was also interesting later in the when there was a lot of confusion about whether using canines or not would in fact be violating people's rights. There was a question of like, well, why are we even hearing about canines? And I was like, I don't know. That was their testimony. That was law enforcement's testimony of why they felt that this bill shouldn't move forward. But I would argue that canines can be definitely a part of the solution. If we're looking for human trafficking, if we're looking for other substances that are more likely to be brought into our state, like fentanyl, like different opioids, cocaine, et cetera, we don't need a dog who's trained on cannabis. We need them trained on that. And the last I've heard, I've asked for statistics. Is there this huge black market of cannabis coming through our state? Nobody's been able to give me evidence of that, because the reality is that part of legalizing this did help us regulate it, right? And it's a lot riskier to get cannabis on the black market than it is just to go and get safe, regulated cannabis from a dispensary.
Yeah. And I will say I was still am a little embarrassed at myself, because there was a senator that was kind of going on and on. He was holding up the container saying, this is odor-proof. I can't smell it. You can smell it. You know what? And I did break decorum, and I just said canines. And he was like, what? I just said canines. And he said, we're not discussing canines. I said, no, but they are. And that's at that moment, the leader of the committee was like, sir, if you could please. And I was like, yeah, that's totally my bad. I feel embarrassed. I ended up talking to some advocates afterwards, and I was like, man, I'm really kicking myself for doing that. I didn't mean to. They're like, no, if you were going to do it anyway, you honestly did it perfectly, because you kept it short to the point. But anyways, that, like you said, I think it was suggested at one point that the canines were a red herring, and it's like, no, but the law enforcement made that testimony. And to your point, they did, according to an annual cannabis report that I'll link in the show notes for people if they'd like to look it up. It's produced by the state of Illinois, their cannabis regulation oversight officer. There's a section within that report for the Illinois State Police, and they said, we haven't trained canines since 2020. However, in light of recent court rulings and an anticipated Supreme Court ruling, we may begin to resume that training, right? So to your point, we weren't just bringing in the canine point to make the conversation more difficult. It was part of the conversation thanks to our friends in law enforcement. Mm-hmm. So.
And I have a different bill. I know we weren't going to talk about this, but it's a canine bill in our prison system, because there's a big debate on whether or not to scan mail or not scan mail because of substances that may be coming in. So if there are canines who are not yet at the age of retirement, but are trained on cannabis, then perhaps we should be using them in our incarceration system to make sure our mail is clean of substances. And that way the dog doesn't have to retire right away. But I do think that for normal police activity, a canine who is trained on cannabis isn't really needed in Illinois at this time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I won't dwell on this point too much, but it is sort of funny how you hear about, funny is not the right word, but it is ironic that there's still a really large issue with drugs in our prisons. And it's like, man, if we can't even keep it out of our prisons, how are we,
Well, and, I'm trying to work across the aisle with my colleagues on an MAT-MOUD bill in our prisons for incarcerated members to get the medical treatment that they need if they have a substance use. And part of this is because substances are getting into our facilities. People who maybe weren't using those drugs may be using now in our facilities. And so we want to be proactive, both in making sure they can't get into our facilities, but also those who maybe come in who have substance use or have formed a substance use have the ability to get treatment, especially when it comes to opioids. And so somehow I've got all these different drug bills, I suppose. It's not necessarily what I thought I would be doing as, someone who is an advocate for our planet. But, I think that there's a lot of things that need to be cleaned up and ways to help people.
Yeah, I mean, it's criminal justice reform, and I think that we definitely need it. People that are committing nonviolent offenses, simply possessing something. It's amazing how easy it is to, again, not making any allegations here. This is just stuff we see in the news where people get drugs planted on them, or like you said earlier, the way we started off this whole conversation. If something goes down like what we're trying to prevent going down, which is somebody being detained, searched, or even worse, solely because of the smell of cannabis, it's unlike other crimes in that how are you going to convince a jury, yes, indeed, the car smelled like cannabis? Are you going to wheel the car into the courtroom? Like you said, with other crimes, there's body cam footage you can review. I'm just making things up, ballistics, witnesses. There's things that you can prove. But with this odor-proof container, it really just comes down to the discretion of a law enforcement officer. And again, I want to reiterate, using a phrasing from the Supreme Court debate, we're not saying that, this is the third time we've said it, people should be consuming before, during, operation of a vehicle. We're simply saying that if you want to use odor of cannabis as a reason to further a traffic stop, whatever it may be, it should be in conjunction with the totality of the circumstances. So like you say, you pull somebody over and you smell cannabis and you see a lit joint in their cup holder. That's a problem.
Yeah.
Or they've been driving erratically and the car reeks of cannabis. Like these are things that, like we say, the totality of circumstances. So
And some of those things would absolutely trigger a sobriety test.
Yeah.
And so them asking you to do a sobriety test is very different than being having your vehicle searched or you being detained and arrested. And so I think that, it's in the best interest of everyone to follow our laws.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the subjects you brought up, I didn't necessarily plan to discuss this today, but you reminded me that you made this point. Hemp, and I'm going to use the two legal terms really quick because we're talking about cannabis, but hemp and marijuana, which that's, again, the legal term. I generally prefer not to use that term because of some of the history behind that term, but right now that's the legal term, so just using it since we're talking about cannabis. They smell exactly the same because they are exactly the same. There's an arbitrary legal distinction between the two, and like you say, as a result of that, with hemp, you can travel in and out of the state. The smell is, it's like questionable whether that can be used as probable cause because it's hemp. It's a completely legal thing you would be smelling. What's like your your stance on hemp? I know that subject had kind of like heated up within the last.
Well, just to clarify, so there is a federal law that allows you to move hemp between state lines. And so
Right.
I think that law says something like you cannot stop or detain someone from moving hemp across different lines as a intercommerce type product. But at the state level, there's quite a debate. And I'm assuming you mean Delta 8, Delta 9. Is that the question?
Yeah,
on hemp?
consumable hemp. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So I think that when we are getting out of line with packaging and explaining what things are, with having look-alike products, I think it's dangerous. I think any parent could understand the importance of not giving a child a package that looks like Skittles, but indeed are a bunch of edibles, how easy that is for even an adult to overconsume that product, let alone a child. So I think that the packaging aspect of it is incredibly important that we start to regulate that. It's no different than food. We have to say what's in food packaging.
Yeah.
You wouldn't want to deceive someone on what they were ingesting. So I think that is crucial. As far as who can sell it and where, I think that there is a big discussion on the equity of where some of these dollars were supposed to go. We've seen the reports of some of the early licenses and the lottery system, and then even more so, even individuals who maybe had been impacted by when cannabis was illegal, that they later, who got licenses, sold them to large companies. And so
Right.
now most of the individuals or companies in Illinois who are profiting from cannabis were never impacted negatively before it became legal. And I think that's really upsetting to a lot of people who have endured their communities being disinvested in, people unnecessarily harassed and arrested, spent time in prison or in the prison system. And trying to make that whole is really important to me. However, I'm not quite convinced that Delta 8 and Delta 9 are the way to go. I understand that when people felt they were phased out, that they were creative in carving out using the hemp licensing to make that happen. But there's a lot of questions to how safe some of the products are. And if you're changing it with one substance, who's to say we're not going to find other substances that are harmful being put into that? So what once was a very maybe low risk cannabis product may now be a high risk Delta 8, Delta 9 type product. And so I think there's a lot of concerns about that. And also the question is, do we want gas stations just being able to sell this? When I was on the Will County board and the state had legalized cannabis, there was a lot of discussion about zoning laws and who was going to get licenses and who wouldn't, whether we taxed it or not, and how much we taxed it at. All of those things were reasons that some people voted to even allow cannabis in the county. And we did increase here in Will County, we increased our buffer around school zones and like advertising where you can and can't advertise that, only to have all of that stuff kind of skirted after the fact, that the 7-Eleven now can sell an edible product that may get you high or not. So that kind of undermines what the community was even asking for. So I think that this is going to be obviously a longer conversation, but I think what we have seen in all areas of life is that when we regulate things and have clear laws, honestly, everybody then benefits, because then it can be taxed. Those taxes can go back into the community. You can make sure there's safety and other regulations that are important. I think the key part of this, though, is making sure that we are creating I think that reparations are due in some case. And so that we're investing back in our communities and trying to make them whole. And that's not just individuals who were in prison, but families in those individuals, communities in those individuals. So we do have our $3 at the state that are directive to go into grants, especially for new nonprofits and small organizations to go after those dollars. But there are lots of counties who get taxed on this and cities who get taxed on this. And nothing necessarily makes those cities or counties put those dollars back towards their communities who have been harmed. In Will County, because I sat on the board, we did carve out those dollars and put them in a special fund. And those dollars are really meant to go back to people who have been impacted by the war on drugs. It would be nice if other communities did the same thing. So this is a call out that if you live in a local community that's not doing this, to go talk to your city council members, go talk to your county board members and ask them, what are you doing with the cannabis dollars? How are you investing them back in? I know the state's going to continue to do that, but we're not the only person who could be helping in these situations. So yes, we want to make sure that people who have been impacted can continue to profit and put those dollars back into the community. But I think we might need to find a way to do it that is safe and regulated.
Yeah, and I've seen over this, like you say, kind of contentious debate. I've seen several different proposals come out, and what it seems like, at least on this subject, is that the Illinois cannabis system was so highly regulated and limited in its participation that hemp has almost seemed like a pathway for those that couldn't get into that system, a pathway in. Like you say, it's not subject to R3 and things like that, but setting those things aside to just address the public safety, the public safety concerns that I think a lot of people share, that you've kind of explained. Do you think a proposal like, I think I've seen a few different ones, but I know like for sure in the Senate, Senator Willie Preston, who I always joke is not related to me. I'm Cole Preston, Senator Willie Preston. We're not related. But I saw some proposals in the House, two different proposals, one from Representative Ford and one from Representative Sonia Harper. And it seems like the similarities between these proposals are this idea that you kind of were talking about. People need to know what's in it. So required testing of these products, required labeling of these products. And then the big one that hits the news a lot is age gate. These products should not be sold to kids. What do you, I guess, think about a proposal like that? Obviously it sounded like you had other concerns with regard to like where it's sold and stuff like that. But just on its face, have you heard of this concept?
I mean, I think though, and don't quote me on this because I didn't read every word of this bill, but my understanding is that what the Senate passed last year during lame duck did exactly that. It clarified all of the packaging rules of it. It also gave up to, I think, 9 months for individuals who were selling this to sell their back supply. It also gave time for individuals who were producing Delta 8 and Delta 9 products to become licensed under the cannabis law. I don't know what else that you could do to try to merge the systems together. I mean, I think in the past it was, they didn't give enough time to get licensed and to sell our back product. And I think that's why the 9 months were negotiated, to make sure that the individuals had that time. And then, yes, it absolutely regulates the packaging. And so I'm not quite sure why the House didn't feel that that was fair to their communities. I'm not sure what they were asking for in the House, but I did vote for the hemp bill in the Senate because I think it does those things. It provides a pathway for people to become a part of the legal cannabis system, but also tries to heal stores who are trying to get rid of this product, and also make sure that the consumers are protected.
Yeah, and I think that so I wasn't, don't quote me on this. I was under the impression that like you say, it definitely clamped down on this, but the big impression I got was it gave that carve out to the brewers, who I actually had the leader of the brewing guild, or I can't think of his name right now, Ray Stout. He does stuff with the Illinois craft brewers. It gave a carve out, like you said, but ultimately the impression I got was that it wouldn't allow kind of, and of course business as usual is not a great term because we're trying to add reform, but it is this idea that, cannabis maybe should be allowed to be sold at Benny's, or, maybe even the gas station. Maybe, like you say, there are considerations for zoning where the gas station is, if it's near a school or whatever. But I think that's the reason I found interest in this topic, is it is federally legal cannabis. And as a result of that, not only do you not, I don't want to say you don't have to worry about the odor proof thing we started off with, but because it's hemp, presumably in a perfect world you wouldn't, right? It also did away with like a lot of these things that I felt kind of are treating cannabis as a scheduled substance, like, you know, the idea that it can only be sold at a dispensary, and that you know, it can only be sold at a limited number of locations, versus the way that hemp works. And I actually interviewed the cannabis regulator who oversees both cannabis and hemp. His name's David Lakeman. And he said, Cole, the difference between the cannabis license and the hemp license is, if you would have applied for a hemp license this morning, you'd be walking out with one this afternoon. And I think that I feel like that is the core contention, you know, even with that Senate bill that you mentioned, where it was like, yes, there were carve-outs, but they were temporary. And I'm not as familiar with this pathway that you were talking about. I'd have to do some more research, but I just got the sense from people that opposed it that it just didn't make it as easy as like starting a bar. And
it's more expensive, to be very clear. I'm not, there are certain things you have requirements to have. And I think that we need to back up a little bit to make sure people understand how this got legalized. I mean, obviously we know medical cannabis, the route of that, and then they moved into recreational. But part of the reason that people got the votes for that is because there were assurances given to that the communities could help control some of this. Now, as cannabis and other substances become more normalized, some of that stigma goes away. So for maybe some of your listeners, they're like, what's the problem? Cannabis is legal. Let's get on with the show. But the reality is that there are individuals who were not on board with legalizing cannabis, and they had a lot of concerns, and part of this is continuing to educate them. And those concerns were met by saying we would only sell it in certain places. There would be clear advertising. We would not advertise to children. And so to then kind of wash that away and pretend like those individuals don't matter, that's not fair, right? And that's when we start to see a clear division, like you're disrespecting my fears and my currents, not my Senator Ventura, but that residents. And so a lot of being a public servant, I started at the beginning, is listening to people and then trying to meet not just their needs, but sometimes listening to their fears. And if they are logical fears, doing something about that. And if they're illogical fears, trying to educate and calm someone. And so that's a big part of what happens in compromise, in negotiations.
Yeah.
So I get that we're continuing to move with cannabis. And I don't know, maybe there will be a day that Delta 8 and Delta 9 is allowed all over the country. I don't know that we're there yet. And I think we're not there yet because people still have a lot of concerns. And there is still a stigma that some people have about cannabis. And so what I would say is that the best route of moving the needle and normalizing stuff is to do so within the laws that exist today and continuing to push the needle. It would have been different if they had come and said, hey, we want to carve out maybe a different licensing for Delta 8 and Delta 9 because, we have this need. And then, working with the lawmakers there to make that happen, as opposed to finding a loophole, exploiting that loophole, possibly endangering children. Like now you have a bigger fight, in my opinion, because you're having to undo some of the harms and undo some of the misinformation about it.
Yeah.
And so, and I think I say this because of another bill that I'm working on, and that's one with psilocybin, and that there is stigma there, and we've seen some huge benefits in how it helps people with their mental health, but yet it's considered a Schedule 1, right? No medicinal value.
Right.
But we've known since the 50s that there is quite a lot of medicinal value to this medicine. And so part of that isn't just jamming it down people's throats. It's about educating. It's about saying we're going to have a safe, regulated place for individuals to go and consume this product for the need that they have. Now, indigenous people from all over the world have used this in ceremonies and with their communities to help heal and connect them, and all kinds of other spiritual ways as well. But if we just come in there and say, well, we're going to do this in America the same way, we would get such a kickback. And then we saw some of that in the 70s when Timothy Leary was out there gallivanting and using it in those kind of regards. And so I think the important thing here is as we want to normalize how we use plant medicines, we want to make sure that people are on board and they don't feel that we're being destructive to their communities or disrespectful to their needs and fears, even if they choose not to partake of that substance. And so I see a lot of that happening with Delta 8 and Delta 9. And to be honest, a lot of that is also tied to money, right? It's really expensive and hard to get a cannabis license, by the time you're done getting all the things you need, your business might have had $100,000 in debt before you open the door or more. Where if I go get a hemp license for $100 and I don't have the same regulations for storage and money and everything else, then yeah, it's a lot cheaper. But does that mean it's right? I think that pushes the system back further and people getting more angry with the system, feeling like they're not following the respect of the rest of the community members who voted on this.
Yeah, and that's what I had heard from like you say, people that were kind of opposed to this bill, including Speaker Welch, who basically said, this is really the foundation of this. You can go a lot of different ways on this subject, but the foundation of this is that there's become this perception that the social equity program hasn't delivered. And like I kind of started this whole thing off with, that's why some of these people have went down this path. And now the interesting part is a lot of the big cannabis licensed companies in this state are selling hemp now too. Like Green, not to give people free advertising, but these are known names: Green Thumb Industries, Curaleaf, Wana, who is I've shown people Wana products and like, oh, that's the gummy brand. Like people that don't even use cannabis they've associated the branding. And so I guess my last thought on this is I'm curious if have you heard any more debate? Like I said, Senator Willie Preston has come out, and I'm just curious if there's like a possible different approach, because the way I've been looking at this particular subject is like, I've been saying, take the best and leave the rest. So the products advertised or marketed towards kids with lookalikes, those are already illegal. But you'll see companies like Mars Wrigley, like they've been suing some of these companies for infringing on their copyright. But I guess, again, in the spirit of taking the best and leaving the rest, like, one of the crazy things about hemp is that because it's descheduled, you don't have to, I don't know if you're familiar with 280E and how that plays a role in cannabis, but it's taxes. So you're like, how you would be able to do normal deductions for a business. Well, because you're selling a Schedule I substance, you can't. But now these people that are opening up hemp divisions, including the big companies, they're realizing like, oh, we can accept credit cards. Mm-hmm. We can ship across state lines. There aren't purchase limits or possession limits for our customers. And I just wonder, I know that you didn't lead the charge on this, but just as somebody who's a senator who may have to vote on this again, do you see, especially since the debate has gotten more perspectives in, do you see a different path forward?
Yeah, I mean, there's always a different path forward. I think that some of these big companies will be, or if they haven't already, be lobbying federal lawmakers, Congress, to probably move forward in that pathway so they can have their tax write-offs or their shipping across state lines. But I think that there's always a way to negotiate. Look, if this is about making sure that local community members are able to go to business and have those dollars reinvested, then why not have something like, all right, 100% of hemp products will go into the R3 program, and those dollars have to be invested back in. Right. I mean, there's ways to do that, to make sure that those dollars are going back into our communities. I don't know that's even been asked, to be honest. Right. It's basically, we feel we got cheated in the past, and they were. We feel we didn't have an equitable way to get licenses, and that's true. So therefore, we're going to do our own thing anyway. Well, how often has that helped people in the past? Probably not so much. So instead, I think we say, yes, these things happened in the past. This is how we'd like to make it right. And that's a pathway that I would be interested in, because we know that when we invest dollars back into our communities, especially ones who have been disinvested, we see huge changes, whether that's better access to education, resources, or different job growths. That changes an entire community.
Yeah.
And so we want to make sure that we have the money to do exactly that. And the one thing that's nice about cannabis, or possibly hemp, is that you can carve out these special funds to make that happen, where they can't then be sucked up into our general revenue funds and spent on other things. And so if we already see cannabis in the large industries and corporations moving into the hemp market, it is to snuff out the little guy. It is to make them a non-viable player. And so the minute that happens, then what? Now, no money went back into those communities. The initial our $3 did. So I think that there's an argument to be had here that in order to really help our communities, that we should be, again, making the pathway for those individuals who are selling this product now be able to be regulated and licensed, continue their business, right?
Yeah.
That's really important. And to make whole where we can in our communities. I'm not naive to the fact that we can never undo the wrongs of the past, right? But we can start to create pathways forward that create, wealth in our communities where it has otherwise been prohibited.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess that's my last thought on it, is that it just seems like it is a good opportunity people are taking advantage of. And there are good actors. And obviously we've been made aware of some bad actors. But I guess just like my last thought on it is, it was interesting to see the cannabis companies sort of pushing for this legislation when, like I say, the opportunities didn't seem as clear cut, and it would effectively, from what I understand, shut down the local retail option. But another question was asked where it was like, it would still allow for online sales. And it's like, man, that just feels like a slap in the face to Illinoisans, where it's like, yeah, sure, you can buy it online just like you always have, but no, you can't go to your local corner store or whoever you've been acquiring this product to. So like, I just am happy that it seems like we're at a point now where we're not so much talking about outright bans. We're talking about how do we make these products labeled accurately, not sold to kids, and tested. Mm-hmm. Because again, that was supposed to have been the lesson we learned from cannabis prohibition, is that we can't just ban things, right? So yeah, I feel good about the spot we're in there. And you brought up the next subject that I had planned to discuss with you as we start to wrap up the show, the Cure Act. Do you want to tell we've actually discussed the Cure Act on the show in the past, but it has been a while. Do you mind just kind of giving?
Sure. So the Cure Act has essentially 4 licenses for psilocybin. For the listeners who don't know what psilocybin is, commonly known as magic mushrooms.
Yeah.
And so the 4 licenses would be a healing center where you would have to go to the location to utilize the product, a facilitator who would sit with you during the administration of the product, but also would do the prep work beforehand to make sure you're a good candidate, as well as integration afterwards. And our bill mandates 3 integrations. 1 has to be done at the facility after using the product. And then the other 2 could be done at the facility. It could also be done with a therapist if they're willing to have a waiver for that. And then the 3rd license is growing the product. And so some of the things we've taken away from the argument with Delta 8 is that we have it as a naturally grown product. So we try to subvert any unnecessary loopholes that we could. And then the last is a testing license. So you could hold the first 3 licenses, but you would have to be an independent tester. You would not be able to obviously test your own product. And so the thought behind this is creating places where individuals can go utilize this medicine where they're safe and they have the supportive network. So the way that psilocybin works, it creates neuroplasticity in your brain, which basically is kind of like a clean slate. Some of the people have talked about before. If you think about a hill with snow on it and you go sledding, that creates a neural pathway, represented by the sled path. Well, if you go back up to the top of the hill and you go to sled again, it's easier to go right back down that same groove that you created already. So that's essentially how your brain kind of functions. It has a neural pathway. why would it create new pathways if it has one that's working? The problem is a lot of times people with PTSD have a pathway that is not working for them, but their brain gets stuck on that same thing. So then taking psilocybin is like putting new snow on the mountain. So when you go up to the top, you have any path you can choose. Of course, if you're given no additional help, you're probably going to choose the same pathway and you're not going to be healed in a sense. But working with therapists who can guide you perhaps to a different pathway, you can get unstuck from things like PTSD or other things. We've seen addictions. We've seen people with weight issues, whether it's anorexia or bulimia, depression, anxiety. There's a lot of clinical studies that have been going on since 2012 when this was able to start testing and doing clinical studies again. So it's got FDA breakthrough status for things like PTSD and major depression. Some of the FDA trials have some hiccups because you can't have a blind study. Most people know that they're on a trip when they're taking a substance that has impacted for 6 hours. Yeah. So there's some concerns on how it can be legalized through the FDA process. But in the meantime, there's been so many individuals who have been helped by this. It is legal in 2 states currently, which both did it through referendum, and that's Oregon and Colorado. Oregon was the first, and they have their healing centers up and running. Colorado finalized their 2 years of licensing and education and ramp up, and they've just begun this year to open up some of their healing centers. And so we were hoping that Illinois would be the next state, the first to legalize it through the legislation. We do have bipartisan support on this bill. My bill currently has 22 co-sponsors in the Senate. There is a version in the House as well as a pilot program in the House. And Arizona and California have also legalized it. Or, I'm sorry, they passed their bills. However, their governor vetoed both bills. And so I believe those states are also refiling, and about 22 states have some form of psilocybin laws that they're looking at right now. So this is coming one way or the other. It's how it's going to come, I think, is important. Currently, Robert Kennedy Jr. is also a proponent of psychedelics, and now that he oversees health services in the United States, it'll be interesting how that topic changes there. And so I think it's really important for us to look at how can we make sure that people have access to this and it's in a safe format, but not just the medicine itself. That's only half of it. It's the therapy part that really helps the individual get off of the pathway that they were on and create new healthy pathways. And so you really do need both of them. And we feel that this bill provides the best success for that individual.
Yeah. And so you put it pretty well, but I'm just going to put it like plainly, just in case people are like, this wouldn't, correct me if I'm wrong, this isn't just legalizing tripping, man. You'd be in a very controlled environment, like you said, with a licensed healthcare professional. And it would be a process of not only getting walked through the experience, but there's also this idea of integration. After you're done, like, it's time to apply the knowledge you've gained, for lack of better words, through that experience, right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
So no retail sales. You're not going to your corner dispensary and picking up this product.
One of these days, right? Hopefully, at least from my perspective. I'm curious, and if you're uncomfortable with this question, I get it. But have you ever consumed cannabis or psilocybin?
I have consumed cannabis, and I'm not a fan.
Not a fan.
I know your listeners probably don't want to hear that.
It's okay.
But for me, it slows down my brain processes too much, and I feel very disconnected. And, one of the things that really motivates me is being connected to people, planet, and myself.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey, and no offense here. I try to bring on people from all aspects, all perspectives. An episode I'm releasing soon is somebody who doesn't believe cannabis should be legal at all. So, totally welcoming of other perspectives. I meant to ask you on the last subject, just because I brought up Senator Preston's legislation. I'm not expecting you to know it off the top of your head. But are you familiar with it? And a reason I bring him up is because he is like the one senator that voted against the hemp legislation. Sorry, I don't know if I made that clear that I was switching back to hemp.
No, I understand, and I know his position on it is that this is harming his communities by not allowing them to sell that. I don't know all the ins and outs of his bill. I haven't read it. And so I think that there, again, continued conversations could be happening, and I'm not sure exactly all the things his bill does, but I would hope that he would work with Leader Lightford, who is carrying the hemp legislation in the Senate, to make sure that his community members are as healed as possible and that they have a pathway forward.
Perfect. Yeah, cool. And we'll just kind of lightning round through the rest of these. I've only got two subjects we might lightning round through. One that I meant to ask you about earlier because you brought it up in your intro. I saw it in an interview that you had given maybe a year or so ago. Campaign finance. I saw you had a bill for judicial campaign reform. But just like generally speaking, it sounds like you have like some a focus on the topic. Can you just like explain like
Sure.
why and why, but also maybe like where you see that being addressed in the future, if you see it being addressed in the future?
Yeah, so I think that lawmakers should not be bought and paid for, whether that's through dinners and gifts with lobbyists or campaign contributions from corporations. I'm not talking about the small dollar campaigns. Like we do have campaign caps on individuals in the state, but 10, 20, 30,000 more than that, more than 60,000. I think that when you start to get to those big numbers, the question is this really you supporting a candidate because you believe in what they stand for, or is this you expecting something in return? So some of us would call that legalized bribery.
Right.
And so I've got a lot of concerns about that. So in order to make sure there's no conflict of interest of how I vote on bills, I choose not to take corporate donations. I choose not to take certain lobbyist dollars. If they are a member-run organization, then it's different. I feel the members are putting their hard-earned money towards it, versus just a company's profits that could be off the charts. And I think we see this at the federal level all the way down to the local level.
Yeah.
And each state and local entity have different rules on this. Because of Citizens United, it makes it that's a Supreme Court ruling, makes it very difficult, saying that corporations are like people and they can essentially put their support in for candidates unlimited. Sorry, I got a tickle in my throat.
It's all good.
And so last year last General Assembly, I filed two bills, one for judicial campaign reform as well as one for everyday candidates. They're both contingent on individuals putting money on their taxes. They would check a little box saying that they want to donate towards this fund. And it would also, the candidates themselves would have to say that they're a clean campaigner. And so it doesn't prevent someone from taking money from corporations. So that's why it gets around the Citizen United ruling. However, it does send a clear message to people that they don't take those dollars. And I mean, I've had some tough uphill races. And I think that one of the reasons people support me is because they know that without a doubt, I'm going to be down there listening and voting with their interests. Even if their interests don't align with mine, I will still listen to them. I will still consider how I can balance their needs and wants. And it will never be because somebody gave me a big campaign donation or took me to a fancy dinner. It will always be because I listen to my constituents. And I think all of America wants that. Well, all of America, except for maybe some corporations,
right?
But general voters want this. And so I did not file the one for regular candidates. And that's based on the Arizona model where they have that because of the amount of money it would take to get that off the ground. However, I did refile the judicial one because we limited that to appellate cases, appellate judges and Supreme Court judges. So we saw in the last Supreme Court race record profits, and I don't quote me on the number, how much went into that race, but it was very hefty. And so the idea is, do we want judges bought and paid for? I mean, this really gets to the crux of it. Now, judges cannot participate in their own fundraising. They can't ask for dollars. They're not supposed to look at how much money is being raised. They have to hire a treasurer to be able to handle, or a fundraiser to be able to handle that. And the thought is to try to separate the individual who's running for judge so that they don't inadvertently vote on some future case because of who gave them money, right? So we already recognize that there is, a gray zone or a conflict of interest when it comes to money. We know money can sway people. And so that seemed like the most likely route to go. Kwame Raoul, when he was a senator, had filed similar legislation, and we've tweaked it so that we can get around some of the constitutional hiccups. And so it would a judge candidate would have to come forth and say that they were a clean campaigner. They'd have to show that they were able to raise some amount of money to become a qualified campaigner. But those dollars would be limited, I believe, to $1,000 or less per donor. And then they could utilize funds from the General Assembly in order to run their campaign. And at that point, they could not take additional dollars from corporations or individuals because they would be funded by the public. Mm-hmm. And so we did put certain caps on that. We did put initially, to really get it up and running, we needed a fair bit of money because if all appellate candidates and Supreme Court candidates ran for this dollars, you would want to make sure that there was enough money in there. So it's a continued conversation. We don't have money in this budget, obviously, but at some point, I think it's a conversation that we need every voter and resident saying, like, do they want to continue the status quo where corporations heavily fund candidates? Or do we want the people to be making those decisions on which candidates move forward? And this really does happen at the local level because a lot of times these corporations are not funding people running for city council or school board. But those candidates then continue to go up the level. And when you get to these state races and these congressional races, it takes millions of dollars to run some of these races. And so in order to win that, they start listening to people who are willing to donate that type of money. So well-intended candidates can sometimes find themselves on a track they never anticipated that they would ever be on. So I've run races, $75,000 is what I raised to the $5 million my opponent had, or that's my Senate race, $85,000 to the really millions of dollars that my opponent had. And so I think that seeing where the money comes from can tell you sometimes where that candidate is going to end up having to lay their loyalty. And if people don't want to see that as a system anymore, they have to start supporting the idea that we need to do something different.
Yeah, I just think it's probably one of the most important topics of our time period that relates almost to any other topic you want to talk about, because it's just, like my last few experiences going to Springfield, like I'm not with an organization. I just am passionate about a lot of these different subjects. I'm trying to learn more, trying to be more involved. And I would walk into some representatives or senators' rooms and they'd have a notepad out and they'd say like, who are you and who you're representing? And I'd be like, oh, I'm Cole. I'm just here representing myself. And they'd like look up at me and be like, almost like refreshed. And I just, I don't know if people realize that it seems like that's how not only Springfield works, but just politics works in this country right now, where you're not either hearing from a lobbyist or you're being swayed.
And I want to be fair to the system, but that was a big shocker to me too. So I had knocked doors for 9 years before I got to the Senate. And so I've heard a lot of problems in my community and I've thought about solutions. And so I came in, 45 bills is what I filed my freshman year as a senator. And one of the questions the staff asked me was, well, who's bringing this bill? And I was like, my constituents, they gave me a problem and I'm trying to find a solution. And they would mark it down as a sponsor initiative. And I didn't really know what that meant until I started looking at other people's bills, and they were brought by agencies, or they were brought by corporations, or they were brought by, advocacy groups, right? Mm-hmm. And so to be fair to Springfield, if I'm just running a bill for one person in the state, there could be all kinds of unintended consequences, right? Yep. And I might be solving that one person's problem, but am I really using all of the people's resources to solve that person's problem? Is that fair? Versus an issue like, healthcare, right? That's impacting tons of people. So when we run a bill like that, where lots of advocacy groups are on, or different businesses, for example, then you might be solving problems for lots of people. So to be fair, I understand why maybe a member initiative bill is not, higher priority, or it takes a little bit more effort from the member to explain why this is needed and why this would help people, as opposed to a bill that helps, thousands of people, millions of people in our state, possibly. However, when you start looking at why is this bill brought, and maybe it's brought by the NRA, right? Then people have a different a concept of that. Or same thing, if this bill is brought by Planned Parenthood, right? So then it starts to say, well, why was this bill brought? How does this help people? And so you have to start asking those questions of who's bringing this, who's not. There are other times too that it puts a lot more effort. So like if I bring a bill forward and then later I find out something like the ACLU supports my bill. Now I have a whole network of people who are helping me, or environmentalists, support a bill I might file. Even though it necessarily wasn't brought by them, they can really help move the needle in educating other lawmakers on how this helps. And they can bring other testimony forth and say, yeah, this person was also impacted by this. So now it builds the story that I'm not just solving one person's problem in my district. I am indeed impacting people across the state in a way that is positive. Likewise, if people have issues with the bill, they're going to come forward and say, whoa, your bill will put me out of business, or your bill will make it, impossible for me to do something.
Yep.
And so balancing that is really important. And so I want to be fair to the fact that we move bills generally when a lot of people are impacted by them, right? But at the same time, I want every constituent to be encouraged to go talk to their lawmakers, because there are lawmakers at the General Assembly who will hear what you have to say, who will file the bill. And if other people come forth, or there's a real move to make this happen, the bill moves. And so I've had a couple of my bills that have moved that came literally just from somebody who called me or came into the office and said, I've got a problem and I want you to solve it. You're my representative. And that's how democracy is supposed to work. And so I want to continue to encourage people to do that the power of the people still outweigh the money if they believe in it and they make the system work for them.
Yeah, and I think a good example of that is back to that odor-proof hearing. There were a lot of witness slips filed in support of that, and just something as simple as that really showed the support that there was for that. So I just realized we're over our time, so I want to be respectful of that. I wanted to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to meet with me. And not only that, but like kudos to your staffers and to you. Like when I said hi to you, when I sat next to you, and I was like, here's my card. I thought you're just kind of being nice to me, and that I'd have to like follow up and reach out, and your staff reached out the next day. It was like, let's make this happen. So I just wanted to thank you for that. And I guess before we go, did you either last words or anything that you're particularly excited that you're working on that you wanted to just close off the show with? Just kind of give you two options before we go.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on. And, I want to drive home that I have an open door policy. So, people should feel comfortable going and talking to their elected officials, no matter what level it is. And I hope to lead by example in showing that that's possible, and that not every elected official is going to blow you off. So hopefully you get that message, and that you try to hold your elected officials to a higher standard if you feel that they're not responding to you. That being said, gosh, I'm working on so many things, and I think that you can go to senatorventura.com to follow along, get on my newsletter. You can also check out my bills on ilga.gov. And I think this is really important to have continued conversations, and that we don't let money run the agenda. I think we've seen at the national level and in some places the local level where that is outshining everybody else, but it doesn't have to be. And I feel like I'm a shining example of that. I didn't get to where I am because of the money. I got to where I am because of the people who supported me, who believed in the things that I believe in. We knocked doors. We encouraged other people to join us. I work across the aisle to try and solve the problems that all of us have. And in the areas we disagree, like we saw in the cannabis hearings, I've gone and talked to the people on the other side of the aisle. I've given one-on-one time with them so that they can understand why I'm pushing the bills I'm pushing, and I hope that they do the same thing. So I just want to give people faith that the system, while it is broken and it needs some reforms, there are individuals out there who are doing the work, and you just got to find them and give them that support.
Yeah, well, hey, thank you for doing what you do. I appreciate your public service. Thank you for giving me the time once again. And I do have a quick, easy last question for you. Did you have a good time with me this morning?
I did. Thank you.
Awesome. Well,